Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow's Friday, Parashat Matot, Masay. We are a double header. We're going to complete the book of Numbers, getting closer to the new year, which is hard to believe. We always think about it. Once we enter the month of Av, it's also Rosh Chodesh, it's Shabbat, and we are going to be entering the 9 days before we commemorate the terrible tragedy of destruction of our temples on the 9th of Av. And I always, since the terrible tragedy of Gush Katif, which is going to be 20 years, it happened in the year 2000, we're talking about the 10th day of the month of Av, which was the day after Tisha B'Av. That's the day officially it happened, although they planned it on the calendar, on the English day, to do it, I think it was August 14th, whatever it was, and that turned out to be the 9th day of Av, so they pushed it off to the next day, which if we're familiar with Jewish history, when the temples were set afire, when the Romans and the Babylonians destroyed our temples, we all know that it continued to burn on the 10th day of Av. That's why the restrictions we have about drinking wine and eating meat and wearing fresh clothes that are laundered, we're not allowed to do so until half the day, until Chatzot HaYom of the 10th day. And that's the day that was chosen to throw, 8,400 Jews out of their home in Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and in northern Samaria. Just a terrible tragedy, which we are paying the price. This crazy time we're in now, the war, the fact that the Iranians were able to build up such a strong proxy in Gaza, and they were able to commit what they committed, the atrocity against Israel in October 7th of 23, of murdering and kidnapping when our, it's just hard to believe. It's hard to even repeat and say what they did. But what they did to our people on that day was a direct result of the atrocities of the Oslo Accords, which was in the 90s, as we're all familiar with that, when a murdering a person, Arafat, a murderer, a terrorist of the PLO, was recognized, and they created the Palestinian Authority, and they created the Oslo I and Oslo II. Slow process. They said, let's start with Gaza, and Jericho was first, and then later the rest of Judea and Samaria, when they gave oath to the Palestinian Authority over autonomy over our holy land. And we're talking about early 90s, 1993 and 4, that time frame. And that was the prerequisite, that was the preparation for the next stage. What happened when Ariel Sharon decides, because of personal political nonsense, going against his own party, to declare one-sided withdrawal in Gaza and northern Samaria. And unfortunately, the deep state of Israel was doing everything in its power to arrest our youth that were protesting and do everything they can to help them implement something that's so inhumane. And we're thinking about people that, when we're being murdered by terrorists, and they were fighting for our existence there, and they were not only had to bury their loved ones, they had to dig up the graves and rebury them on other places. People lost their jobs, their families, their business, everything. It was just a total destruction. And they were yelling, and we were all crying. I'll never forget those cries we did. We were saying, don't do this, and it's going to backfire and all that. And look what happened. It took 18 years until the 2023 of October 7th, on our beautiful holiday of Simchat Torah. Instead of being able to enjoy the holiday, we had to pay the price for that terrible process, which began with Oslo and it continued. And then it led to the peak of now, of everything turning around, and a whole other story going on in Israel. That tragedy, and we see to ourselves, and I want to connect to the portion. We see and we ask ourselves, what's going on over here? We saw the great miracles that have taken place in Iran, when Israel in 12 days greatly destroyed the Iranian nuclear capability, what Israel did in Lebanon and the other proxies and in Syria. But unfortunately, we still were greatly challenged with Gaza, and this reminds me very strongly, if you think about the biblical events that have taken place, when Achav, the king of, it's well familiar with Achav, the evil king of Israel, and his wife Isabel, whatever you call it in English, Isabel, when they decided to come against an innocent individual, he had a vineyard, we all know. And when they came and decided to, the wife, Isabel, she placed false witnesses and they put him to death just because Achab wanted this field, and the spirit of Navot, Israeli, his spirit was hovering over Achab and his family for them to pay the terrible price they did for that act of murder and stealing and taking away his field. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy, but that reminds me so strongly, if you see a terrible act committed against an individual, a field, the king decided he wants his vineyard, and what they did against that one person, his spirit, that the Bible describes his spirit that was calling out from the under, his blood that was spilled, the terror, and of course his inheritance, and all that was taken away from him. That became, that price later had that punishment, the price that had to be paid for that terrible tragedy was placed upon the perpetrator, Achab, and etc. And that we can make some kind of comparison, say to ourselves, wait a second, if we think about all the injustice that was done to the thousands of Jewish people living in the Gaza area, there were 21 vibrant communities from Gush Katif and onto the northern section of Gaza that were living there, beautiful, beautiful communities, many along the beautiful coastal area, and just a decision of just a detarded, warped decision of Ariel Sharon led to the terrible tragedy of them losing all that. And think about their spirits calling out, and all those people that were murdered there to try to hold on to the land, and what was done, and the lack of sensitivity. Those very places that are in what we call Otei Aza, the kibbutzim that are today, that were evacuated as a result, and that were infiltrated by the Hamas terrorists, and they did it. Many atrocities were committed to them, particularly, and other places as well. Those atrocities were a result, was a direct result of throwing away Gush Katif, of course, and allowing them to build up and make an army there, and they create a terrorist state, and all the money investing in that, and that allowed that to happen. But on the other hand, those very same people in the kibbutz, they believed in this lie, and they were demonstrating against those people, pioneers living in Gaza. And we see their spirit of all those that gave their life for Gaza. And again, all the tragedy of the dead bodies had to be uprooted from there, together with everything else that went on, and the injustice. That was a boomerang that came back. It took 18 years. What is 18? In Hebrew, the word 18 means life. I thought of that concept. God was saying 18 years, that's chai of life. Think about how beautiful life was, and was turned around and destroyed their lives. And now their spirit is going to awaken the wrath of God, because we have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to see the exact the precise result of this terrible atrocity, what happened in as a result of that. And therefore, it took 18 years. And now we're in this terrible battle, and we see great things happening, but we still have to respond and try to understand why so many of our great soldiers are falling in battle, and so much tragedy there. Those are putting their lives on the line. And the tragedy is not over. We're still trying to cope with these monsters of Hamas until we totally overcome them. And this is something that we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? Why so much life is being spilled? And one answer, it's hard to answer questions like this because we can't understand these things. But we can always, as I said, try to make these comparisons and say to ourselves, the spirit of those individuals that were hurt so much, the damage, the evil, the atrocities that were committed to our precious pioneers that were living there, what was the injustice done to them, all that is not going into empty space. Their cries and their tears, but the price has to be paid. And unfortunately, when the angel of death is unleashed, there's no distinction made between the righteous and the non-righteous. God, we don't understand, but when he sends his hand of wrath out, the good and the evil will fall together. And because in reality, we have to unite and understand and rectify together. And that's an important thing to remember. And every time this time of year comes around again, we have to remember not only now the destruction of our temples, but a destruction of our communities, which was brought about by our very own, which was hard to fathom. And that's one side I want to just to open with that. I want to bring down a very, very important point here. And we have to realize the importance of all of Israel. And here we have there's a few things going on, many political things going on in Israel today that we have to relate to. And one of them is the great disagreement between the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox, who are, we all know that they left the government. They're still supporting from the outside at this point, but the government could go down because of the what we call the Chok Gius, the law, the recruiting law, which they're waiting for. And Israel is waiting to come up with a law that will be satisfying on part of the Haredi world, together with the government and the other parliament members, that they can come up to some kind of a law, an agreement of presenting a law where it will allow for the Haredi young men to participate in the battlefield. And there was some kind of, right before the strike in Iran, there was an agreement that was reached, but somehow after it was all over, Edelstein, he decided to make changes, and that fell apart, and now the parliament pushed him out, and they put in someone named Bismuth, whatever it is. They're going to try to push a law for the recruitment of the Haredi young men to the army. At least we're talking about within 3 years, they're talking about, I think the numbers were 17,000 soldiers on their side. And the question is, how do we relate to this? Because, of course, the left, who easily would make a deal with the Haredi world, but now that they're on the opposition side, they're calling this just trying to draft dodging and all this kind of thing. But how do we relate to that sentiment amongst the Haredi world not wanting to participate in the army? What is that coming from? And it's not that they don't want to participate in the army. They're claiming two things. Number one, they want their children to go to the army the way they were educated and remain that way when they come out, Orthodox Haredi Jews. And they're afraid that a lot of the influences of being amongst other soldiers could bring them down spiritually. So the Israeli army is already taking measures in setting up, for example, regiments like the Hashmonaim, the Chativa, the different brigades that will be able to incorporate them in the army and maintain their needs. But whatever it is, this is still a very big, big discussion and debate amongst in Israel today, and it's in many ways being used politically just to create political friction and all that. But we want to understand the deep thing behind it. And the deep thing behind it, which is something we have to related to our portion, is when the Haredi claim that those who make Torah their profession, in other words, they are Torah scholars from morning to night, and they spend all the time studying Torah, what we call in Hebrew Toratam Omanutam. So that kind of concept, that kind of category would say that they're not the ones to be recruited. The ones to be recruited are those that are the regular, boys that are not spending day and night studying Torah, and they are willing to allow them to start to join the army. Of course, on our side, in the camp of the Orthodox religious camp, the Zionistic camp that we're in, our rabbis, we were all taught that we have to participate in battle. Doesn't make a difference, Of course, we there's no one, like as well, saying just like the Haredi world honors and appreciates the importance of Torah study. Of course, our camp does as well, and there are those amongst us that are great scholars that have done less army, but the army is something that we believe personally that we have to participate in, and we want to, especially when it's a mitzvah, it's a milchemet mitzvah, a war we call a mitzvah war, a war that if we don't fight, we are God forbid, we are in danger of destruction. And those kind of wars are, everyone has to go to the battlefield, but these are part of the issue. But the question is, to understand what the Haredi, everyone, when we're talking about big camps, political movements in Israel, we can't totally nullify another camp's view. We have to try to understand what their point is. Obviously, they have some kind of an important issue that they're trying to clarify. And that's the answer is, how do we relate to those who study Torah and those who are involved in the spiritual aspect? And that is very, very important to understand. That is, there is, it's 100% truth there, that the power that those who are involved in spirituality and spiritual growth, that brings tremendous victory to Israel. So that is something that has to be understood on the part of the secular camps, that they don't believe in it. And of course, we as Orthodox Zionists, we know that, and that's why we respect, we have a lot of respect for those who study Torah and make that their entire lives. And the argument is only amongst those who don't do so. Those who are regular individuals that go to work, they can they can spend time in the army as well. So, but of course, the secular world is totally lacks that understanding of the importance of Torah study. And here I want to bring down to the portion. One of the quotes, which I'd like to teach you here, is the Malbim, which is fascinating, a fascinating approach. But first, let's read a little of the verses here. And we look at our portion, it's a double portion. There are many, many different topics. Opens up with the laws of oaths, and then we talks about the war, battle. We're talking about the battle of Midian, the Midianites. And God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, it's brought down in 31, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael meta Midianim. I want you to fight, take a revenge of Israel against the Midianites. We all know what we learned about the previous portions of Balak and Pinchas, about the terrible downfall of Israel as a result. The 24,000 Jews who fell in the plague as a result of the Midianite woman that were able to bring them down when they committed acts of sexual offenses and idolatry. And that was, so therefore God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, you now have to go to battle against this before he leaves the world. This was his last major mitzvah that Moshe Rabbeinu had to do before he is leaving the world, is to battle against the Midianites. And then God goes along and says like this, he says, Elef lamateth, 1,000 for every tribe. It's repeated 1,000 for every tribe. L'chol matot Yisrael tishlechu latzava. From all the 12 tribes, you have to send people to battle from every one of the tribes. Now, if we look in that verse, we can understand it a simple way. If it's elef lamateh, it's 12,000 soldiers we're sent to battle. That's one way of looking at it. But the Midrash brings down, and they learn out something very interesting. The fact that's repeated 3 times, there are different opinions, but there is an opinion which was a fascinating Midrash, which I'd like to read. Midrash Rabbah. And the Midrash teaches us that there were, I'll just try to say it by heart, to save time. The Midrash says like this. It says there were 3 types of categories. There were 12,000 soldiers that went to doing the physical battle. There were another 12,000 soldiers that they were in charge of watching over the vessels. In other words, they had to do guard duty. They had to watch over the camp. Right. And then you had another 12,000. Their job was to pray. Their job was to be involved in the spirituality. So we see right over there, first of all, the division of the, according to the Midrash, was that each of those were equally divided. We needed 12,000 fighters. We needed 12,000 from the elite forces. We need 12,000 involved in the guard duty, and we need in watching over Israel from the camp itself, and we need 12,000 those involved in prayer. In other words, they were the yeshiva boys. They were the studying Torah from day and night. We needed all three groups in order to be victorious, which is really fascinating. And that's really what the Midrash says over there. And I'd like to quote in here Rabbeinu Bechai. Rabbeinu Bechai, one of the great commentaries, and he says like this. He says, I should first read the verse, which is really fascinating. There's a verse brought down in our portion in 31:49. And let me just read that verse to you all quickly. Israel's coming over to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they're saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, Lo nifkad mimenu ish. What does it mean, Lo nifkad mimenu ish? They're basically saying that not one soldier fell in battle. Now think about this kind of situation where you send soldiers to battle and everyone comes back with not one person injured in battle, not one person missing in battle, not one person killed in battle. That was the situation here in the battle against the Midianites. Now this was a claim of Israel when they came to Moshe Rabbeinu and explained they wanted to bring an offering. And the Talmud has a beautiful explanation. Maybe I should quickly bring the Talmudic passage down. The Talmud says like this. The Talmud says, "V'nikarav korban Hashem, ish asher matzah klei zahav etzadat tzmid tabat agil v'kumaz." We look at the portion. There were different spoils of battle that were taken from the Midianites, and there were these different types of ornaments and jewelry and bracelets, and some of them were called kumaz. What is kumaz? And what are these things? I'd like to read. The Talmud's like this. Amar Rabbi Elazar, agil ze dfus shel dadin, kumaz ze dfus shel beit הרחם. אמר רבי יוסף, יחי היינו דמתגמינן מכוך, דבר שמביא לידי גיחוך. אמר לי רבא, מגופי דקרשמה מן הקומז כאן מקום זימה. Let's quickly explain. So basically what the rabbis are saying here in the Talmud is that these ornaments, these were jewelry, but more of like jewelry garments that were used in very non-modest places that were placed by the Midianite woman. And they were made out of whatever it was, like they were made out of, since there were jewelry and things like that, or ornaments that were made out of fine metals, etc., gold, silver, whatever it was. And they were used to cover certain areas that weren't modest. If you can picture that, I'm going to go into more details over there. But that, and the rabbi, one of the rabbis, brings down, and he says, actually, if you look at the word itself of kumaz in Hebrew, could be used as an acronym. Kan here is a place of zima. Zima means of sexual iniquity. So, in other words, these were used, these garments, whatever they were, ornaments were used to be placed on certain areas in order to arouse those that they brought to sin, etc. So now what happened was, when Israel went to battle, they defeated the Midianites, and they took these very vessels, these ornaments, etc. And Moshe Rabbeinu, then it says, Moshe Rabbeinu got upset, right? Moshe Rabbeinu got upset at the army officers, and there we know he got upset because they left alive certain parts of Midian. But the rabbis continue to say, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Baravua, Amar Lahem Moshe Yisrael, Shema chazaltem lekilkulchem harishon. Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned that perhaps they went back to their first kilkul, to their sin before, because what happened was the fact that they let alive those women, the very women that brought them down, and Moshe Rabbeinu was questioning that are they returning to that same sin? and here they're holding those ornaments of those women. Amulo lo nifkan mish. So the answer to Moshe Rabbeinu, not one person fell in battle. In other words, if not one person fell in battle, that's a good sign. It's a sign that we're not coming from, God forbid, a place of sin. Anyway, that's a Talmudic discussion which goes on. I'm not going to continue from there. I just wanted to show that the battle here was a battle where there was miraculous. And we look at the words of Rabbeinu Bachye, and he brings down very strongly, he says like this, Lo nifkad menu ish, zahaya pela atzum, he goes, this was miraculous. Umehanisim magdolim, it was one of the greatest miracles she'iru Yisrael, that happened to Israel. She'ira lehen kan, b'milchemet Midyan, she'yu rav kechol asher al tzfat hayam, because the Midianites were a huge population, like the salt, like the sand on the sea. Vagu Yisrael mem, and Israel was able to kill them. V'shavu mehem alafim urvot, and they were able to take in captivity tens of thousands. V'katuv me'id shelo chaser Yisrael echad b'milchama, and the verse describes that not one was lacking in battle, missing in battle. V'neis gadol hazeh lefi shayu shleimim b'zchut, because the reason this happened was because they were complete in merit. And then it brings down the Talmud, as they said over here, they did not, God forbid, want to commit any sins with these women. Again, after what they did before, Israel was clean. Israel was clean. Now, the Malbim brings this all into a perfect understanding. And he explains and he talks about the division. The Malbim says like this, he says that they were commanded to give 1 out of 500 from those, they were divided into two parts. Those who went to battle, right? So that we say, if we look at those who were called to battle, so that number was, as we said, 12,000 actually were in the battlefield. So they were given, right? They had to give 1 out of 500 of a tithing, 1 out of 500 to, we'll see in a moment, who they have to give this to. They have to give it to the Elazar, Kohen, the priest, who was the high priest, right? Pinchas ben Elazar, right? After Aaron passes away, it was Elazar that was the high priest, and then Pinchas was his son, right? That the whole battle, he went to battle here, we know in the story. So anyway, so 1 out of 500 was given over as a tithing to Elazar. And the Malbim says, and that came from those who, the 1 out of 500 were the 12,000 that went into battle. And how does that happen? He explains something very interesting. He says like this. He says, and the rest, the other half of the other part of Israel, the whole congregation of Israel, they had to give 1 out of 50. Okay? שכמו שהעידה שלחה למלחמה י"ב אלף שהוא אחד מ-50 מ-600,000. If you think about it, if you take the whole congregation, he's saying, the whole congregation of Israel was 600,000. So they were the ones who sent to battle. So the 12,000 soldiers represented all of Israel, 12,000. If we take the percentage, right, 12,000 out of 600,000, so that's times 50, correct? So that number of 50, 1 out of 50, was what the rest of Israel, the Eidah, the congregation, had to give from their spoils, and they gave it to the Levites as a tithing, you can say, to the Levites, which is really interesting. And he explains, and he goes on to explain, I'm not going to go into all the details, but he explains at the end, and he says, what is his words of it? He says like this, he says "V'kavat tumat Elazar Kohen mechelek yotzim mitzvah le'ir oznam." He goes, why? We're talking about the Kohanim got, Elazar Kohen got his portion, and the Levites got their portion. He's trying to explain, in order to awaken, to realize, shelo b'chalbam yirshu, right? The ones who actually did the fighting itself, they had to give their parts to Elazar, who was the high priest. Why? To realize it wasn't their swords, Yeshu Eretz, right? It wasn't because of their swords that they were able to inherit the land. That was the vessel, of course. But it was the power of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, his merit, his zchut, and the power of Pinchas, his son. And he was carrying, as we know, the holy vessels. He was carrying the tzitz. and he was carrying the trumpet. And therefore, the son brings blessing to the father, right? Pinchas brought blessing to his father, Kohen Gadol. And the Levites, of course, that they are watching over, explains how the Levites, they had the function of prayer and song in the temple, right? And they had to watch over the tabernacle. And their prayers went up to the heavens. So the power of the high priest, Elazar, and the power of the Levites, right? They're the ones who received. We're talking about the 1 out of 50 to the Levites, 1 out of 500 to the Kohen, right? And he talks about how really the 1 out of 500, right? That's 10%. If you think about the numbers, 10% of 1 out of 50, it's like another tithing. We know usually the Levites have to give a 10% of their tithing to the Kohen, but here, all of Israel gave that 10%, that additional 10%, right? And he explains why. I'm not going to go into all the things he talks about here, but it's fascinating is that the idea was to compensate, to give compensation amongst those who went to battle and all of Israel, to realize that those powerful the spiritual forces of Israel, the Levites and the high priest, that they were in the battlefield, but their merit and their great spiritual leadership that they're doing has that ability, to bring the victory upon Israel. So it's all together here. And of course, we don't have to look far. This is a common concept amongst Israel and the Torah. We see a combination of these kind of things together. As an example, when Moshe Rabbeinu fights against, he tells Joshua, go out and fight against Amalek. And Moshe Rabbeinu, when they're holding his hand up and he's fighting, it's a combination of spiritual and physical war, right? It's all working together in unification. We see also the great miracle in the whole book of Joshua. Only because of Achan sinning that brought about 36 individuals that fell in battle, right? Or there are different opinions. If it was 36, it was like 36 that fell in battle as a result of the sin of Achan. But besides that, we see the great miracles that took place, how the walls of Jericho come down. So when Israel is working together in perfect unification, in perfect, in the perfect balance, where there are those in battle, those are praying, everyone's doing their thing together. So we are gifted with a beautiful victory without any losses. That's a great miracle. That's a fascinating miracle that we have to be thankful for. Taking these concepts in consideration, bring it back to what we're talking about today. I say, there's no reason that we cannot merit in such great things today. Israel has to be an awakening. The hard thing is when you're dealing with the elements, and I could tell you, for someone living here in Israel, the very, very left progressive, what we call the deep state, and what's going on inside Israel, and they're warring against Israel from within. Those forces bring a lot of trouble and calamity upon us. And it's very complicated. And how do we cope with such a thing? We pray that people will turn around and repent and realize, wait, it's just wake up, open your eyes. But we see, unfortunately, that the people that actually have fallen many times, and we see so clearly the mistakes they've made, great former generals and prime ministers, all that, doesn't make a difference how many times they can make a mistake, and every time being wrong, but they continue in their follies. They totally continue in that same path and not waking up. But we have to go forward, and we have to do what's right. And what's right, Israel is fighting the most just war, and we have to finish the job. This week a friend asked me to speak to a group of reporters. He was leading a tour for reporters from all over the world. They were in Israel. They're still based in Israel. They wanted to talk to individuals of Judea and Samaria, and asked me if I could speak to this group. And I'm sitting down there, and we're an hour and a half, they're questioning, all kinds of questions going on. It's just unbelievable. You see what goes on in the world, right? Where how the Hamas is working so hard in portraying the lies, and they're so quick, the media, to swallow up every word of Hamas as holy, and they're just jumping on the opportunity to demonize Israel claiming Israel is committing atrocities, genocide, starving now. The big thing is starving the Azatians. These are lies. These are lies in Israel. No matter what we do, I mean, it's just they're coming always. Look what Macron from France, that one, he wants to declare Palestinian state. Another bluff and a lie. I mean, my goodness, if you just look at history, there's no room. There was never a place for a Palestinian state here in Israel. If they want, let it set up in France or in other places in the world, but not here in Israel, in our homeland. There's no room for an Arab state here. There's only one state of Israel, the land of Israel. And we have to cope with these forces, or we're being attacked from within, we're being attacked from without, and physically and spiritually and on levels of media. It's a huge battle we are trying to cope with. And we have to add more and more merit, and we call it Hebrew zchuyot, to our arsenal, right? Zchuyot. We have zchuyot, we have perfection in our spiritual being, so God will bring us, as we say here, a perfect victory. What is a perfect victory? Without any losses, God forbid. We see, as I mentioned before, those ornaments that were taken. They weren't taken, God forbid, for sinning. The opposite. They wanted to give that as an offering. And Israel takes all that, I would say, that garbage, right? Where to come from, those ornaments, as we said, from the iniquity of the Midianites. When you turn that around, you take those very vessels that we use for sinning, and you turn that into holiness. Then we will merit in war without losses and total victory, redemption, and true peace in the world. Well, God willing, Bezat Hashem, we are entering this difficult period, and precisely the time of rectification is the 9 days for the destruction of our temples, the baseless hatred amongst Jews that led about the destruction of the Second Temple, the sins of the First Temple, which were idol worship, murder, and sexual crimes. We have to rectify all these realms, and through that, we will surely be merit and seeing very speedily, very soon, our full redemption. Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov. Let's pray that this month, Menachem Av, will be a month of rejoicing in the building of our third temple. Shabbat Shalom.